My life felt like a chess game where, unbeknownst to me, I was merely a pawn in a larger play aimed at preserving someone else's image of a perfect family. But at some point, everything fell apart, lies surfaced, masks were torn away, and I was left facing a choice. My name is Danila, and I grew up in what you might call an ordinary family. But let me tell you, from the day I was born, nothing about my life unfolded in an ordinary way. I was the second violin in our family orchestra, with the first undoubtedly being my older brother, Tom. He was their golden child, the apple of their eye. My parents pinned all their hopes on him. Tom was meant to take over the family porcelain business, founded by our great-grandfather, and turn it into something grand. I, on the other hand, was somewhere in the background. Tom got all the attention, praise, and the latest gadgets. He had the newest phones, gaming consoles, and expensive party invitations. Me? At best, I got his hand-me-downs or a night with a nanny if my parents were busy. Don't get me wrong, I didn't hate Tom or my parents. I just couldn't understand why it was so important for them to appear wealthier, smarter, and more successful than they actually were. Danila, stand up straight, my mother would hiss at family gatherings. And for heaven's sake, smile. What will people think? I'd plaster on a fake smile and count the minutes until I could escape to my room, the only place where I could truly be myself. The only real light in my world was my grandparents, my mom's parents. They lived in a cozy house on the outskirts of town, and every visit there felt like stepping into another world. With them, I felt important, heard, and loved. When Tom graduated high school, my parents threw a lavish party, inviting all their friends and proudly announcing that he was off to a prestigious college, carefully chosen for him. My father patted Tom on the back, saying, "Our boy will make the family proud." And me? I stayed home, continuing my unremarkable life. Years passed, and I decided it was time to think about my own future. I researched colleges and chose a program that truly excited me. All that remained was to tell my parents. The next morning, over breakfast, I gathered all my courage and said, "Mom, Dad, I've decided which college I want to apply to." Their reaction was, to put it mildly, shocking. My father smirked. "College? For you?" My mother let out her fake laugh. "Danila, don't be silly. You'll be working in the shop with us." I tried to protest. "But I want to study." But my father cut me off. "We're not wasting money on your education. That money is for Tom's new car." My mother added the final blow. "Listen, Danila, you're just not cut out for college. You'll be much happier in the shop." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. All my dreams, all the effort I had put into my studies, were worthless in their eyes. Without saying another word, I ran out of the room, tears streaming down my face. I knew one thing: I had to leave. The only person I could turn to was my grandmother. Dialing her number, I choked out, "They said I'm not fit for college." There was silence on the other end, then my grandfather's firm, resolute voice, "Pack your things, Danila. We'll pick you up in an hour." I stood at the threshold of the house I once called home, feeling a strange mix of emotions. My mother hugged me, but her gesture felt unnatural, almost rehearsed. She ushered me inside, repeating how glad she was to see me. The house looked exactly as I remembered it, but it no longer felt familiar. The walls were covered with photos of Tom, his graduation, his new car, a celebratory dinner for his promotion. My eyes searched for something, anything, that reminded me of myself, but all I found was an old family photo tucked away on a shelf in the corner. My mother bustled around the kitchen, explaining that they had prepared a special dinner in honor of my visit. I sat at the table, feeling like an unwelcome guest, when Tom appeared. He was the same as ever, confident, deliberately friendly, with that smug smile that always left me with mixed feelings. "Sis," he exclaimed, hugging me as if we had become best friends over the past year. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. The dinner unfolded in typical family fashion. My parents gushed over Tom, his new achievements, his future plans, and his brilliant prospects. Tom will be a partner in the company in a couple of years. Can you imagine, Danila? My mother said proudly, as if it were her own success. I nodded, trying to hide my despair. No one asked how I was doing in college, or what my plans for the future were. I was merely a backdrop for yet another celebration of Tom. After dinner, my mother invited me to the living room. I sat on the couch, expecting another chapter of the family tale about Thomas the Magnificent. But instead, she brought out a box of documents and set it in front of me. "We thought you might be interested," she began, choosing her words carefully. "It's something from the family business that was left unfinished after your grandfather passed." I glanced at my father, who said nothing but whose expression was telling. He clearly wasn't thrilled about me seeing these papers. I opened the box to find old invoices, lease agreements, and a few letters. It turned out my grandparents owned a small part of the business I'd never known about. It was a separate line, unconnected to the larger store my parents managed. I was surprised they had entrusted it to me, not to Tom, not to anyone else, but to me. "We thought," my mother continued, "that you might take this on after college. After all, it's a family endeavor, and you've always been so diligent." Those words struck like a bolt from the blue. Diligent? Me? It felt like the recognition I had craved since childhood, yet it came with such a cold undertone that I didn't know whether to feel pleased or wary. I thanked them, trying not to reveal my confusion. Tom, who had been silent until then, suddenly smirked. "I think it's a great idea. Maybe you'll finally find your calling, Danila." I clenched my teeth but said nothing. His tone seemed condescending, but perhaps I was just looking for hidden insults. The night passed uneasily. Lying in the room where I had spent most of my youth, I pondered what was truly behind this offer. Why now? Why me? Deep down, I suspected this wasn't an act of goodwill, but rather a hidden agenda tied to their expectations or a desire to rid themselves of an unwanted burden. Maybe they just wanted to offload something they couldn't handle onto me. The next morning at breakfast, I mustered the courage to ask, "Why did you decide to give this to me and not to Tom? He's always been the one involved in the family business." My father froze for a moment, then cleared his throat and replied, "Tom is too busy with his projects. He has big plans. We thought this might interest you more." His words were too smooth to be true. Tom sat across from me, sipping his coffee and shrugging as if he couldn't care less. Later that day, I took the box of documents and left, feeling like I was leaving behind not only the house, but also my childhood illusions. On the way back to college, I wrestled with whether I should take on this responsibility or leave it as it was. My heart told me this could be a chance to prove to myself that I was capable of more. Yet something inside kept whispering, "They'll never change." I froze, watching the scene unfold. Tom, for once, seemed to lose all his usual arrogance. His face flushed, and his hands nervously fidgeted with the cuff of his shirt. Sarah, in contrast, remained remarkably composed, though her smile had become thin and strained. She was watching my father intently, as if trying to gauge what he might do in his temper. "Are you serious?" Tom finally said, his voice sharp but tinged with something akin to pleading. "You want us to give up everything we've planned?" "Everything's already booked." Father scoffed in reply. His face had turned crimson, as it always did when he felt he was losing control. "You didn't even consult us, Tom. You're so caught up in your new life and your fiancé." He nodded towards Sarah, who raised an eyebrow slightly at the derisive tone in which she said, "Fiancé, that you think you can do whatever you want." "Well, you can't." Sarah stepped forward, her voice still soft but with a steely edge. "Mr." She paused, as if she couldn't remember his name. Father didn't bother to help. This wedding is an important event for both of us. We want it to be special. Tom has told me how important reputation is to your family. Don't you want people to see that your family can afford something remarkable? She deftly appealed to his pride, but I could see it only made him angrier. Mother, who had been silent until then, finally spoke up. Her tone was conciliatory, though barely masking her nerves. Perhaps we can find a compromise. I'm sure there's a venue that would suit everyone. It doesn't have to be extravagant, but it should still be special, shouldn't it? Father turned to her with an expression of utter disappointment. Special? You call this place special? He jabbed a finger at one of the photos in Sarah's folder. That's a resort for millionaires, not for our family. We can't afford such expenses, and I'm not going into debt for their whims. Tom sighed heavily, then turned sharply to Sarah. Maybe we should consider another venue? Something more reasonable? His voice sounded as though it pained him to say the words. Sarah looked at him as if he had just betrayed her. Her eyes narrowed, and without a word, she slammed the folder shut and clutched it to her chest. She then turned to my father. If that's your final answer, then I think Tom and I need to discuss our plans privately. She marched out of the room, her heels echoing like drumbeats in a march to war. Tom hesitated for a moment before hurrying after her. I stood by the couch, glancing at my parents. Father was visibly seething, his breathing heavy like after a marathon. Mother nervously twisted a napkin in her hands, avoiding his gaze. Well? Father barked at me, glaring as though I was supposed to side with him. You see, don't you? They're just trying to pressure us into paying for that damn wedding. I shook my head, trying to mask my exhaustion. I don't know, Dad. It's their wedding. Maybe you should just let them do what they want. My voice sounded calmer than I felt, but inside I was boiling with frustration. They want us to pay for it, he roared. Don't you see this is just another attempt to bleed us dry? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. I didn't want to get dragged into this conflict, but I was already in the middle of it. Then don't pay, I said. Let them figure it out themselves. But maybe instead of yelling, you could try talking to them. Father looked like he wanted to say something but stopped himself, shaking his head. He waved dismissively at me and left the room. Mother remained seated on the couch, looking utterly defeated. I headed back to my room, feeling like I needed time to process everything. But I had barely taken a few steps when I heard Tom and Sarah arguing outside. Their voices were loud, but I couldn't make out the words. I paused on the stairs, unintentionally eavesdropping. If you can't stand up for us, Tom, then why are we even doing this? Sarah's voice trembled with anger. I'm just trying to find a compromise. Tom replied, his voice full of desperation. That doesn't mean I'm not supporting us. Sarah said something too quiet for me to hear, and then I heard the sound of a car door slamming. Moments later, the house fell silent again. Tom stood in front of me, his face flushed with rage. His shouting still echoed in the small apartment. I looked at him, trying not to flinch, but inside I was boiling. His words felt like daggers, but I wouldn't let him see that. You don't know what you're talking about, Tom, I began slowly, barely keeping my voice steady. That money isn't a toy for you to impress your fiancée and her family. They left it to me because they trusted I would use it wisely. Tom scoffed as if my words were beneath him. Wisely? You? You don't even know what to do with that inheritance. It's laughable that they left it to you. You've never done anything for this family except complain about how you're treated. And now you're sitting on the money and acting like you're better than us. I felt a wave of anger rise inside me. Never done anything? My voice grew firmer. Tom, who was there for Grandma and Grandpa when you all were too busy with your important lives? Who visited them every week, helped with groceries, cooked meals with them. You? No, it was me. They trusted me because they knew I valued them, not their money. And I won't let you ruin what they left me. Tom opened his mouth to respond, but his expression suddenly turned icy. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a dangerously calm tone. You can act like a saint, Danila, but I know you. You've always been jealous. You've always wanted to be in my place. And now you've got your chance to feel superior, but don't forget who you really are. You're just the pathetic little sister who will always be in the shadows. Those words, spoken in such a cold, cutting tone, hit me harder than I expected. But instead of letting him crush me, I gathered all my inner strength. You're wrong, Tom, I said, looking him straight in the eye. I'm not in your shadow anymore. And I won't let you manipulate or use me for your gain. Tom froze, seemingly stunned by my words. Then he laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. Well, we'll see how long it takes you to blow through all of it. I wouldn't be surprised if you come crawling back to me for help in a year. He turned and headed for the door, throwing over his shoulder, Sarah was right. You're useless. The door slammed shut, the sound like the final note of a tense symphony. I stood there alone, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. His words still echoed in my mind, but I knew I couldn't let them take hold. Grandma and Grandpa believed in me, and I had to prove their trust was well placed. The next day, I called Mr. Johnson to discuss the best way to manage my inheritance. His professionalism and confidence made me feel more composed. He suggested investing a portion of the money in reliable ventures and using it to build my future career. We also discussed my grandparents' house, and I realized I wasn't ready to sell it. That house wasn't just property, it was a memory of the only people who saw potential in me. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in learning about financial management. I read books, watched lectures, and enrolled in courses. For the first time in my life, I felt in control of my future. Each day brought new knowledge, new confidence. I decided I would use this opportunity to create something of my own, something I could be proud of. But the peace didn't last long. One evening, I received a message from my mother. She wrote about Tom, who, according to her, was going through a tough time. I knew what that meant. He had spent everything he had and was now looking for a lifeline. Mother subtly hinted that perhaps I could help. I stared at the phone screen, feeling a mix of pity and anger. Tom always found a way to make everyone dance to his tune. But this time was different. I wasn't the naive girl who let herself be used anymore. I typed my response, short and clear, Mom, I love you, but I can't keep being the solution to Tom's problems. He needs to learn to face his own mistakes. I pressed send, feeling the weight of family responsibility I had carried for so many years begin to lift from my shoulders. The future still seemed daunting, but for the first time, it was mine alone. I froze, watching my parents make their entrance, as if witnessing a scene from a theatrical production. Mother, adorned with glittering jewelry, looked like a peacock proudly displaying her feathers, while father moved with the dignity of a man who believed he owned all this grandeur. Their presence commanded the attention of the guests, and I couldn't help but feel utterly out of place in this setting, as though I had accidentally wandered somewhere I didn't belong. I tried to hide behind a tall glass of champagne, but my mother's gaze still found me. Her eyes narrowed slightly, lingering on me for a moment before she leaned over to whisper something to my father. Then, with deliberate steps, she headed straight toward me. Danila, she exclaimed with exaggerated warmth, as if we were the best of friends. Her lips stretched into a smile, but her eyes remained cold. How wonderful that you decided to come. I was beginning to think you might ignore such an important day for our family. I suppressed a sarcastic laugh and forced a polite smile. Thank you for the invitation, Mother. The wedding is truly impressive, I replied, sidestepping any mention of my estrangement from the family or everything that had happened between us. Mother either didn't notice my tone or chose to ignore it. Of course, it's impressive. Your father and I worked so hard to make everything perfect. Tom and Sarah deserve only the best, don't you think? Her voice was sugary sweet but carried a distinct note of superiority. Yes, they truly do, I said, feeling irritation rise in my throat. Mother nodded with satisfaction, as though I had just validated her, and her gaze flicked over my dress. How lovely that you chose something so modest. It's so very you, she added, as if it were a compliment. I took a deep breath to keep myself from snapping. Thank you, Mother, I said, avoiding her gaze. At that moment, Father approached. His expression was less theatrical than Mother's, but I recognized the familiar mix of approval and condescension. Danila, he said, shaking my hand as if we were meeting at a business event. I'm glad you're here. I hope you understand how important this day is for the whole family. Of course, Father, I replied, feeling my patience were thinner with every passing second. I glanced at Tom, who stood a little way off, chatting with guests. He seemed to avoid looking in my direction, and I couldn't tell if it was because of his apology over the phone or lingering guilt for everything that had happened. Well, we won't keep you, Mother said, lightly touching my shoulder as if offering some magnanimous gesture of forgiveness. Make sure to properly congratulate Tom and Sarah. This is their special day. They moved away, continuing to showcase their social finesse, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I looked around. Guests laughed, danced, and elegant music played in the background. Yet amidst all this grandeur, I felt like an outsider in a world carefully constructed to maintain the illusion of a perfect family. A waiter passed by with a tray, and I took another glass of champagne, not for enjoyment, but to have something to occupy my hands. At that moment, Sarah approached, looking flawless in her designer gown. Her smile was genuine, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief. Danila, I'm so glad you came, she said warmly, though her voice carried a hint of exhaustion. I know how hard this must have been for you, for all of us. But I truly hope today can be a fresh start. I nodded, feeling an odd mix of gratitude and sadness. Thank you, Sarah. I hope so too, I replied, realizing it was true, even if believing it felt difficult. We spoke for a few more minutes before she was called away by the photographer. I was left standing alone, watching as the celebration carried on, my emotions tangled. For a moment, I questioned whether coming here had been the right choice. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it didn't matter, I knew I was still waiting for something from my family, maybe acknowledgement, maybe reconciliation. Tom passed by and paused beside me. He looked calm, but in his eyes, I caught a glimmer of something that resembled gratitude. Thank you for coming, Danila. It means a lot to me, he said quietly before disappearing back into the crowd. I sighed and looked up at the sparkling chandelier overhead. Perhaps this wasn't a day for drama or discussions about the past. Perhaps this was exactly how it was meant to be. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as a storm raged within me. Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I didn't try to stop them. Everything I had endured over the past few years hit me all at once, like a crashing wave. My parents, who had always placed Tom on a pedestal, their endless pretense, the disdain hidden behind forced smiles. And now they had thrust me into the center of their farce without even consulting me. I took a deep breath, trying to collect my thoughts. I knew that if I went back inside now, I would only make things worse. They had already shown me their true colors, and I had nothing left to say. The car started with a soft purr, and I pulled onto the road. The city lights blurred past the windows as I drove, not knowing where I was going. I just needed to get as far away as possible from the nightmare they had created. Their words replayed in my mind, poisoned, cruel, worthless, ungrateful. But with each repetition, something new began to stir within me. It wasn't grief or anger but clarity. An hour later, I pulled over near a small cafe on the outskirts of town. The sky above was full of stars, and the cold air seeped through the slightly opened window. I stepped inside, ordered a coffee, and sat at a table by the window. Everything that had happened over the past months began to feel distant, like a bad dream. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. My solitude was interrupted by the sound of my phone ringing. It was Tom. I stared at the screen, unsure whether to answer. Finally, summoning my resolve, I pressed the button. Danila, his voice sounded tired, almost pleading. I didn't know they would do that. I swear, I only just found out myself. And what do you want, Tom? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I want to apologize, he said, his words sounding sincere, though I knew him too well to trust immediately. I realized they crossed a line, and I should have stood up for you. You didn't deserve that. Sarah's shocked by their behavior too. We've decided we'll pay for the wedding ourselves, even if it means scaling back half of our plans. I stayed silent, processing his words. Perhaps he was sincere, but too much had already happened. It doesn't change what they said, I finally replied. And you know, Tom, it's not just about tonight. This has been building up for years. Tom sighed, and silence stretched on the other end of the line. I know. And I'm sorry. I truly am. I didn't know what to say. For the first time, he sounded like a real person and not the image our parents had crafted. But the pain from their words was still too fresh for me to simply let it go. I need time, I said at last. And, Tom, maybe you should think about how you want to live your own life moving forward. I understand, he said, and the call ended. I placed the phone on the table, feeling a strange sense of relief. It was a step forward, even if only a small one. Weeks passed. I returned to my life, focusing on work and the plans I had begun building. There were no calls or messages from my parents. I didn't reach out to them, and they seemed to have decided to leave me alone as well. Tom sent a couple of brief messages thanking me for my honesty, but I wasn't in a hurry to reply. I knew that rebuilding our relationship would take time. I still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was steering my own destiny. My grandparents had always believed in me, and now, after so long, I was finally starting to believe in myself. When Tom and Sarah left after their visit, leaving behind a trail of happiness and excitement, I closed the door, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. The thought that I would soon become an aunt filled me with a lightness I wasn't used to. It seemed that my reconciliation with Tom marked the beginning of something new, something I never thought possible. Our family, rebuilt from the ruins of old wounds, now stood stronger than ever. The following days flew by in a whirlwind. My work at the marketing firm consumed me, with one project after another, each more challenging than the last. But for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. My colleagues had become like a second family. We laughed, supported each other through tough times, and celebrated small victories. Gradually, I noticed my confidence returning, layer by layer. Tom and Sarah remained an important part of my life. We often gathered for dinners, talking about everything from their preparations for the baby's arrival to my plans for the future. Sarah became a close friend, something I never expected. Her wisdom and calmness were a true gift, especially on days when I still wrestled with ghosts of the past. One evening, as I sat with a cup of tea, gazing at the city lights twinkling outside my apartment window, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and after hesitating for a moment, I answered. Danila, it's Mom. Her voice was calm, but I sensed the familiar tension. Mom, what do you want? I asked, trying to keep my voice firm. I just wanted to talk, she said. Your father and I, we want to apologize. We realize we've made mistakes, and we want to make things right. I felt bitterness rise within me. For so many years, I had waited to hear those words, but now that they were spoken, they felt hollow. Mom, it's too late. Tom and I no longer want to be part of your games. She was silent for a few seconds, then her tone turned cold. You've always been ungrateful, Daniela. We tried to do everything for you, but all you ever did was reject us. I felt a surge of anger but quickly suppressed it. Mom, it wasn't us who rejected you. It was you who rejected us when you decided your pride mattered more than your children. We're living our lives now. If you want to fix your mistakes, start with yourself. I hung up, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. That conversation with my mother was the final step in freeing myself from their influence. I was no longer the little girl who longed for their approval. Now I had my own life, my own family, Tom, Sarah, and their soon-to-be child, and that was enough. Months passed. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl, whom they named Emmy. I was over the moon when I held her for the first time. Small and rosy-cheeked, she was like a tiny miracle, and my heart felt like it might burst with love. Our gatherings became even warmer. Together, we made plans, laughed, and supported each other through tough times. Sarah often said she wanted me to be an important part of Emmy's life, and I found myself growing more and more attached to the little one. When my parents learned about the birth of their granddaughter, they tried to worm their way back into our lives. They sent letters, tried calling, but Tom and I stood firm. We no longer wanted to be part of their manipulations. Sometimes I felt sad that they couldn't change, but I understood it was their choice. Tom and I had done everything we could to protect our new family. One warm summer day, I sat on the lawn outside Tom and Sarah's house, watching Emmy take her first steps. Her laughter rang out like music, and I realized I hadn't felt this happy in a long time. Tom sat down beside me, sliding a glass of lemonade toward me. You know, Daniela, he began, watching Emmy, I sometimes wonder how things would have turned out if we hadn't gone through all of that. I smiled. Maybe everything happened the way it was meant to. We can't change the past, Tom. But we can build our future. He nodded, and we sat in silence, savoring the moment. Sometimes, family isn't about who you're born with. It's about who you choose.